Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome everyone who has signed on to the virtual unveiling of the MEREDA 2020 Index of 2019 data. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors who make this free webinar possible. First of all, my name is Gary Vogel. I'm the president of MEREDA and attorney at Drummond Woodsum. The MEREDA 2020 Index is underwritten by Eaton Peabody as our primary sponsor. It's also supported by sponsors Dukas Construction, Sebago Technics, and Express Copy. So what is the MEREDA Index? The MEREDA Index is a compilation of real estate economic data. Starting about 12 years ago, MEREDA decided that we wanted to be able to be an organization that would compile this data to essentially graph the progress of the real estate market in Maine. And what we did is we hired Dr. Charles Colgan from USM to review that data and to come up with one number that reflects the progress of the real estate market in Maine. And Dr. Colgan went back to 2006 as our benchmark year. Of course, the years starting in 2008 and thereafter were marked by the Great Recession. So by using 2006 as a benchmark year, it gave us sort of more of a normalization. And it took a number of years to come back from the Great Recession, as the index showed. The value of the index is not necessarily looking at 1 year's data, but by having the progression, the graph showing the progression from year after year really gives information that we hope that real estate professionals and those interested in this information find useful. So this is our 8th year of presenting the index. We typically have presented the index at our annual forecast conference in January. By doing so, we have only been able to present 3 quarters of the year of information in January because the full year information wasn't out yet. And then we would do a second edition of it in the spring that would have the full year. Starting in 2020, we decided that what we would be doing would be unveiling the index on a once-a-year basis in March, containing a full year's worth of information. That was supposed to happen in late March at the MEREDA 35th anniversary gala that was scheduled for March 26th. Of course, we all know in the middle of March, all of our lives were interrupted, and that event has been postponed. We hope to have it before the end of the year. At the presentation on the index at the forecast conference, we typically have a video and a print publication for the index. And those materials are still available, and they're available on the MEREDA website. And I would encourage everyone to go there and to view the index video and to review the publication that we put out. So what is interesting about the 2020 data? I mean, after all, the world has changed a tremendous amount since then. I think the year 2019 that's contained in the 2020 index is useful primarily to show really what's happened since then in 2020. And we're going to spend most of the time today with Dr. Colgan, who's going to go through the 2019 index results, and then we're going to quickly pivot and talk about what's happened since then and try to get a sense of where the real estate market is going and how it's affected by the global pandemic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Charles Colgan, who is the Senior Research Advisor and Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Management at the Muskie School of Public Service. Welcome, Dr. Colgan. And Dr. Colgan and I are going to have a brief discussion after Dr. Colgan's presentation of the 2019 index information.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I hope everyone is settled down with their coffee, tea, or whatever is appropriate. I'll talk very briefly about where we are in terms of the index, and then I'm just going to discuss a few things with Gary. So let me start by just bringing up the data. You should be able to see the MEREDA index and its components here. The index was up modestly over in 2019 over 2018. The overall index, which is shown here in the dark kind of greenish color line, was up 2.2% on an annual average basis over 2018. The residential proportion was up 5.3%. The commercial side of the index was largely unchanged, but it did pick up quite a bit in the second half of the year. The commercial index was kind of slow in the first half and then picked up in the second half, leaving it overall unchanged. The construction employment portion of the index showed consistent growth throughout the year, and if you look at this chart, you'll see that the index as a whole, the commercial sector and the residential sector indexes have been back over the 100 level, 100 being 2006 quarter one. Only the construction employment index had not recovered to the 2006 level, and I'm afraid that it's not going to in the near future, as we'll see in a minute. On the residential side, the index here is the composite residential index is shown in the dark greenish line. The portions related to sales of existing units, existing housing unit sales in Maine have been strong really since 2014. The median price recovered to 2006 levels in about 3 years ago and has generally been steadily trending upward. Or mortgage originations have been steadily trending upward since the bottom of the recession in 2011, 2012. The only portion of the index on the residential side that has not shown significant recovery is residential permits. You see a big spike there in 2019 quarter one. I'm not sure what was going on there. I've actually gone back and looked at the data to see if there's a mistake in the underlying census data, and that's what it actually shows, was a massive increase in residential permits issued in the first quarter of 2019. But overall, new construction has not been significant, at least compared to where it was in the middle of the 2000s. And I think overall this reflects the basic trend in the residential market. Most of the sales, most of the additions, and most of the action has been within existing units with a relatively slow but steady growth in new construction. This befits a population that has been growing very slowly. On the commercial side, the index, as you can see here, it declined slightly at the first part of quarter of 2019, recovered to basically be stable by the end of the year. Positive trends in the number of transactions in the second part of the year, also with the commercial sales price per square foot, and the commercial lease price per square foot. The only area that has been kind of slow, the only area that's been kind of slow is commercial lease rates per square foot have been fairly low, and that's probably because of the there's still a little more supply out there than demand, mostly because of changes in the demand market, probably on the retail side. And I want to just give a shout out here to the Bolus company, which gives me access to their data for the construction of the commercial side of the index. So as you can see, the real estate industry has been through 2019, and it was doing pretty much okay. Had generally been on the upswing, particularly in the second half of the year. The trends of the last 3 to 5 years had been pretty steady. And then this. This is Maine employment through April. Basically, in the April employment number in Maine was a drop of 100,000 jobs in a month. The May numbers will be out in a couple. The May numbers will be out in a couple of weeks. They will probably show an additional 10 to 20,000 on top of this. And here you see pretty vividly, the challenge that we have. This graph goes back to 2008. You can see the Great Recession, and you can see the size of the hole that COVID-19 has dug for the economy in 2020. And you get a bit of a picture of how long it's going to take us to get out of this. How long that's going to be is, of course, the big question of the day. And one of the things I have to say is that so much of the recovery of this does not depend on economic factors per se, but greatly depends on how fast the public health system and the medical system can respond to the health emergency. And that is, alas, way beyond the competence of a poor economist. So I just really don't know the answer. I don't think anybody really does, because it's a more or less wild card event. So with that, that's the quick story on all of this. I'll stop sharing my screen and come back to you, hopefully. There we go.
Great.
And as I say, that's the basic story.
Thank you, Dr. Colgan. First of all, to all of our attendees, I do want to mention that you should be seeing a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have questions for Dr. Colgan, me, or the panel that will be coming up shortly, feel free to post those questions, and we'll try to get to them towards the end of the presentation. So, Charlie, you've kind of answered, for the most part, my first question, which was really about sort of comparing this this downturn, to prior downturns. Obviously, many of us who've been around for a while experienced the 1990-1991 recession, which was particularly tough on real estate, especially due to the fact that the actions of the banks at that time were to really liquidate troubled assets, which wasn't the case as much in the Great Recession. Obviously, we then had the Great Recession, which had a very prolonged recovery. And as you said, it's really difficult to predict this due to the impact of the virus itself. However, looking at in light of the steep drops in employment and the government stimulus, which everyone seems to be expecting another one. Anything further you want to say about that in terms of what what people might expect as people start going back to work?
So there's been a lot of discussion of two things. Well, there's been a lot of discussion about whether this is going to be a V-shaped recovery or a W-shaped recovery, and I think both of those are wrong. I think the best description is a backward check recovery, or a left-handed check recovery, in deference to our left-handed friends. And that means that when the bounce comes back, and there will be some bounce back probably in the third quarter, maybe into the fourth, but it will be far, far short of the drop. And it will be from that relatively modest bounce back that the long-term recovery is going to take place. Now, the bigger long-term question is, how long is it going to take to get back? Are we going to be as long getting back from this recession, which was even steeper than we were from the Great Recession in the beginning of the last decade? Much depends there, I think, on what Congress and the president are going to do in fiscal policy. Um, I think it is within their power to make the recession and the recovery much less painful and quicker. I do not think they will do that. I think they will choose to do too little and do too late, and just as they did in the 2010 recovery. And so I don't know that we will be able to avoid a lost first half of the decade in the economy as a whole.
And obviously, we're already seeing some Chapter 11s from large retailers, and certainly even both locally and nationally, seeing some businesses, go out of business. So we know that there are going to be jobs that are either impacted or lost. And I assume that, for example, with retail bankruptcies, Chapter 11s, even if they reorganize, they're going to close a number of stores, and there are going to be many job losses that aren't coming back, as a part of this recession, at least not to those same positions.
Yeah, retail had up until the 1990-92 recession, the last time that this happened, that retail was one of the leading sectors in the recovery, beginning with the 2001 recession and certainly in the Great Recession. That's no longer true. And in fact, over the last decade, retail has trended down throughout the US in terms of employment. I think that has now dramatically accelerated. And because it was already on a downward sloping trend, the possibility that retail is going to come roaring back just doesn't seem very likely, because essentially there are underlying secular factors in the retail sector that were already pushing downward. We now essentially have pushed a lot of retail off the cliff, and it seems unlikely that whatever the long-term factors are, they're not. They're going to be on the downside. That doesn't mean all retail jobs are gone. It doesn't mean Amazon is going to take over the world. But it does mean that the retail jobs and the physical space necessary to house those jobs is likely to be much less in the next decades than before.
Yeah, that was a point I was going to make, is that obviously retail uses a lot of real estate, and retail in the commercial real estate segment, retail has probably suffered the most in the last few years, and I think that trend will continue. We've heard anecdotally about in-migration demand in Maine as a result of individuals wanting to relocate from urban areas and hotspots, and with the ability of them to work from home. Even before the coronavirus hit, Maine was benefiting to some degree from individuals moving to Maine and bringing their jobs with them. And presumably this will accelerate following an event such as a global pandemic. Do you see positive trends resulting from our experience with the coronavirus, especially here in Maine?
Well, I think this trend of working from home or remotely is likely to accelerate. I'm essentially doing that right now. I mean, not only am I home, my employer is actually in Monterey, California. No longer with USM as I'm retired from there. And my full-time employer is in Monterey, California. So I've been a remote worker in Maine for 3 months this year. It'll be closer to 6 months. And I do think that trend is going to continue. And one of the interesting questions I have about it is whether we are going to really start to attract people from out of state, and whether that in-migration is going to be enough to start filling in the housing stock, particularly in the second and third tier of suburbs around Portland and Bangor and Augusta. The places that were built up in the 70s and 80s as the baby boomers moved out to the burbs, for the schools and the basketball courts and all that stuff. And now the baby boomers are out of that phase. I was in that phase. I lived in Reedfield, now live in South Portland. Is this in-migration because of this freedom that in the reorganization of the spatial economy is providing us? I mean, we reorganized the spatial economy in 2 weeks this year, and it's an astonishing change. How much of that's going to play out into the future? I don't know, but I do know that one of the surest things that's going to happen as a result of this is some major reorganization of the spatial relationships in the economy in directions that are going to be some predictable, some quite unpredictable.
And Charlie, when you say spatial relations in the economy, what do you specifically mean by that, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
Well, look at us right now. If we were in a normal environment, we would be at a hotel somewhere sipping coffee made by some caterer who would have brewed the coffee and brought it in. We'd have all transported ourselves in our automobiles or maybe our bicycles. That's a spatial relationship. Instead, we're all sitting at home, or pretty close to it. We've taken ourselves off the road. We've made less demand on the transportation system. I'm sorry to say that somebody in the hospitality industry has lost the opportunity to sell us coffee, but that's the way in which the relationships have changed. We've just reoriented ourselves from technology in the way that's in our spatial relationships to one another. This was once described as the death of distance. It may yet be described as the not death, but significant wounding of commuting. And all of a sudden, we have to rethink our road systems and a whole bunch of things. So that's what I mean by the spatial relationships. We're always moving in two-dimensional space, sometimes a three-dimensional space. We're now moving in cyberspace, and that's a big change.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at commercial real estate, parking, for example, as part of development is huge. And if we don't have nearly as many commuters and don't have to build parking lots, surface and structured parking lots, that can make a huge impact upon what can otherwise be developed. So, Charlie, I want to thank you for that presentation and this discussion. We're going to turn to our panel. We're going to bring Dr. Colgan back at the end for questions from our attendees. Again, please feel free to post those questions in the chat. But at this point in time, I'm going to bring on our panel. And we've got Tim Soley from East Brown Crown Management. Tim is a real estate developer and owner of a lot of different types of commercial real estate. Welcome, Tim. We've got David Davin, who's a principal at Portside Real Estate Group, a leading residential brokerage in the greater Portland area. And we have Kevin French, who is one of the owners of Landry French Construction, a major commercial construction company. Welcome to each of you. I'm going to start with Tim. And Tim, you heard Charlie's presentation. Before we get into the current information, if you could make some short comments about 2019, the commercial real estate market in 2019, and how you saw that as a landlord and developer, and then we can talk a little bit about what you're seeing since then.
Thank you, Gary. I think the first thing I'd like to say about Dr. Colgan's presentation is my biggest takeaway is that it was what we've just experienced is astonishing. So the fact that we're looking back for what happened last year is interesting, but not as relevant as what is happening, obviously today and going to the future. But I will talk about it, and I think in Portland, for the first time in a couple generations, we saw a wide swath of residential, retail, hospitality, and office move back downtown. And I want to view that through a qualitative lens as opposed to a quantitative lens. I think Charlie did a great job of giving us the quantitative detail. the last decade saw a shift in values in America, leading many to want to live, work, and play in authentic, smaller cities like Portland, where passion for food, high quality education, safety for families, and immediate access to nature are found. I believe this rebirth of Portland, bodes well for us in the years coming out of the pandemic. And I personally intend to continue to, produce high quality contributions of design and construction to the urban fabric. So I think last year, we saw a peak of a cycle, and that we would all agree about. But I think the fundamental foundation of that will carry forward.
So turning to what's going on now, Tim, what are you hearing or seeing from your office tenants, and how does that inform you about what to expect for the remainder of 2020 and beyond? While we're talking about office tenants, is there discussion of office tenants downsizing in order to shift to more employees working remotely? Have you heard those discussions? Or are there discussions about tenants needing more space in order to have workers work safely with physical distancing? Anything you want to comment about the office market based upon your experience, following the start of the pandemic?
So first, I'd like to say these are observations of mine. I have a limited perspective on the entire economy, and there is a high degree of uncertainty about what happens in the future. I go moment by moment about what happens each day as these changes continue to occur. In fact, we just heard a few minutes ago about unemployment coming out again, above expectations this morning. I think the office space transactions that I'm engaged in are relatively robust given the downturn in the economic activity. The interesting thing is, though, there are lots of negotiations. Our transactional completions is low, but not as low as I would think given the drop in economic activity. Meaning that I'm continuing to sign renewals. I'm continuing to sign leases with new tenants. I think they're somewhat bifurcated. The larger, stronger tenants tend to be more active than the smaller tenants. I think there's a polarized effect of the pandemic on space needs. Smaller tenants, and more marginal tenants may not be able to, maintain office space, and they may end up going virtual if they're, on the edge. But the larger, stronger tenants, continue to need space. And I, like most, feel that I've been working about 25% harder for the last several months to accomplish about 20% less. So I think that is a reality for many. At the same time, there will be fewer office square feet rented to some tenants. The larger tenants who for the last 10 years have been reducing the number of square feet per person are now looking at how to increase it. The pandemic world means that we can't pack 5 or 6 people per 1,000 square feet into a space with cubicles and be as safe. The tenants who've done that are now trying to calculate how to bring people back in a staggered way, because the density of office use doesn't lend itself well to the health concerns we have today. And so I can't tell you, Gary, what the final answer of all that is. I think it probably for Portland will matter as much about in-migration and people coming here for quality of life. It'll matter, whether we see people moving here more from Boston and New York to escape what's pretty horrific, in those those urban centers right now, to come to a place that is, I'd say, more in balance and a place where they want to raise families or live and enjoy the outdoors in a way they really cannot in the urban centers. So those, I think, elements will probably bear out more for us in terms of what happens to commercial office space needs going in the next few years.
And when we turn to Deva in our discussion in a few minutes, Deva can give us her, her feedback on the kinds of information and, that she's hearing from people from out of state and how that's affecting, that aspect of the market. Tim, you also own some parking garages, and which have done very well in Portland in the past few years. Do you similarly have any predictions about the market for structured parking in Portland as a result of more people working from home, sharing workspace, things like that, or anything that you've either seen or just willing to prognosticate about concerning structured parking?
I'm always willing to prognosticate, Gary, if people are willing to listen. So, to be clear, first, I have only 2 structured parking garages. Many of my parking spaces downtown are essentially surface lots held for future development. The 2 structured parking garages are one for Main Med, the new garage just completed down on St. John Street, purpose-built, very specific use. The requirement won't reduce, it'll actually increase over the years. I don't see anything about the current pandemic reducing the demand for that parking structure's use for the foreseeable future, not until the autonomic driving cars are whizzing around with no driver and only passengers in them, and delivering people to where they need to go to, and finding their own place to rest that doesn't need to be in a parking garage. So I think that garage, is clearly not being affected by the pandemic. As far as downtown parking, so I have the 4th Street garage. I'm in the midst of expanding it. I've hired an architect to look at adding an additional floor. We intend to be under construction by late winter, early spring. And I see a bifurcation in the demand for parking. So in the urban core, and that can mean really only a few square blocks, those parking spaces will remain as much in demand. And they remain in demand not only for the reason that there'll be office tenants in downtown who need them, and maybe there's a shift in who those office tenants are, but there's also the complementary uses that occur because office tenants, well, they used to be 9 to 5, maybe now they're 8 to 6. But the complementary uses are hospitality with overnight transient parkers, and retail uses, which though are in great pain right now, will come back to some degree at some point. And those are everything from traditional retail to our wonderful food service operations in downtown Portland. So I'm seeing a demand in the very core of downtown being heightened. I have a parking garage that has a list of wait list of over 200 parkers. And what we're seeing right now is many of the parkers who were parking there are moving out, and we're refilling it with people off the wait list. So my wait list hasn't reduced very much, and it's certainly a long wait list that I can't even realistically predict when someone at the end of the wait list would be given an opportunity to come to the garage. And the increased use of downtown for everything from residential, as I said before, to retail in a way that for the first 50 years of Portland's rebirth, from the 70s till now, had shifted to south of Portland to the mall area, or north of Portland to Freeport. All that energy is coming back downtown, and people living downtown in a way they haven't lived for a long time. So those cars need to be downtown as well.
Right, and those are trends presumably that aren't really going to change dramatically. Tim, pivoting to retail, you own a number of your buildings have retail tenants in them. Any comment about what you're seeing in terms of retail? We talked about that a little bit with Dr. Colgan, but I'd love to hear your thoughts from your experience.
Retail has certainly borne the brunt of the pandemic at this point. The retail rentals have been far less robust than the office tenants. I read a report by the CEO of Related in New York City a couple months ago, and at that point, he'd only received 25 to 30% of the retail rentals. The interesting thing about Portland is the tenants with whom I have relationships over years. We work together. We're supporting them. We're doing whatever we can to help them through this. And there is no one size fits all. But the nationals, who many consider credit tenants, are the ones who are not typically paying. We've seen bankruptcies, as been discussed by you and others, from J. Crew to Nordstrom to J.C. Penney. The number of those bankruptcies will probably continue, if not increase, over the next 12 months. And I don't know the answer to which ones are the ones that will survive. So I'd say, in terms of my personal experience, we are at this moment negotiating for new retail tenancies, but I have not at this point signed any new retail leases. There are positive positive retailers who are coming to the market to develop new businesses, and they're looking at starting up in the beginning of next year. And because there are spaces that have become available that weren't just a couple months ago, there's some excitement, but I don't know how long until that translates into consummated lease deals. But the energy is certainly there, and I think likely with creative solutions to allow new retailers to fit up their spaces and get ready for a season that is of indeterminate date. At this point, there'll be new retailers coming to the downtown over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thanks. And last, Tim, before I turn to our other panelists, as a commercial real estate investor and developer, do you see positive developments for investors and developers from this economic upheaval? I mean, I do know, for example, that there have been many investors who have been kind of keeping their powder dry for the last few years, thinking that the commercial real estate in particular, was overpriced, and that they weren't really ready to get into the market at those values. For investors with liquidity and ability to borrow, how do you see the opportunities that lie ahead and the ability to finance those investments?
Well, I, for one, don't know if you'll find any real estate developers who will admit to you that the value of their assets were overvalued. But I can tell you that I'm a contrarian, although not transactional. So that means to me that I never acquire or build or develop property with the intention of selling. I rarely do sell, and if I do, it's because it's not strategic or there's some better owner in some way. From my personal interests, I'm excited. I think there are opportunities in a number of ways. I think there are assets that will become more available for more reasonable values. But mostly, I think the reasonable values will be accompanied with the liquidity in the banking world, which is a result of the Fed flooding, the money supply. So we see exceptionally low interest rates. We see, ironically, at a time that interest rates are at historic century-long lows, especially for intermediate and long-term debt. We see a slight increase in the capitalization rates, or the valuation, of assets. And as you know, when the capitalization rate goes up, the asset value goes down, and therefore the yield is higher, accompanied by leverage that is cheaper and more stable and long-term. I think this builds the foundation for a stronger future growth pattern. So I am excited.
Good. Okay. So thank you. We could continue talking and probably have an hour-long presentation with each of you, but I do want to turn to Deva. Deva, thank you for joining us. First of all, can you give us very briefly a quick recap of what you see as the high points of the market from 2019 that we can use sort of as a benchmark to talk about 2020?
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary. It's wonderful to be part of this discussion. I agree. I could listen to Dr. Colgan and Tim speak all day long. So essentially 2019, was a great time to be a seller. As Dr. Kogan mentioned, we've been in this positive trend in the residential segment for several years. Prices rising 30% over the last 5 years. And last year seeing the highest prices ever. And with that, as Dr. Kogan mentioned, land sales have not recovered. So there's no surprise that new construction accounted for only 8% of the total transactions. So, we expected another strong year in 2020. I predicted our prices creeping about 3%, maybe to 5%. And we saw that in March. We saw prices even higher than they were last June, which was our highest peak in 2019. And so we were really teeing up for this monumental spring, and then the virus hit us, and we saw our listing inventory in April just be cut in half. It was down about 45%. So when you have listing inventory cut that drastically during our peak selling months, it's going to cause a significant shift. In May, we are starting to see an influx of listings. May is usually our biggest month for new listings, but we are still down. We were down 37%. So what does this mean to prices when our inventory is so low? We are looking at right now an absorption rate in terms of months at 2 months of inventory. So a balanced market is 6 months. We are going to be in a seller's market for quite a while.
Interesting. So, obviously, probably the biggest impact then is the inventory. Even though there may be fewer buyers, I'm not sure that that's the case, but obviously with fewer buyers and way less inventory, it's going to continue to have be a seller's market, as you've indicated. Are you hearing from, buyers and sellers specifically? Are sellers reluctant to put their property on the market because they think that they'd rather wait and be on the other side of the recovery in order to do that? Are they concerned about pricing, which doesn't seem to be the case? Are you hearing buyers that are holding back due to expectations that the market's going to soften more? Any insight on those kinds of issues?
Well, I would say buyers are definitely not holding back, and we've seen very limited fall through from the contracts, which is really positive in light of the unemployment that we have. So buyers are definitely not holding back. Sellers, they're cautious, they're waiting, they're working from home, they're homeschooling their children. They're not quite ready for showings that have people in their home. We, as expected, we had quite a pause. In Portland, we were deemed non-essential as realtors, so we didn't have any showings for a spell there, and there was a lot of restrictions. We were doing virtual showings for a few weeks and maybe showing a buyer one property. So they just really dampened everything. Things are easing now. Buyers, sellers, and agents are becoming more comfortable. So we're starting to see things start to get back to a little bit more normalcy.
And in light of the limited inventory, are you continuing to see things like multiple offers and offers above asking price and those kinds of dynamics that we typically see in a seller's market?
It is a little bit bananas. In May, the median days on market was 6. So, for sellers that are apprehensive, the good news is that the houses are selling quickly and for top dollar. When we look at showings as an early indicator for under contracts, and we had started to see the spring in March, and then it literally just fell down, and we were dragging along, just really minimal showings late March, April, and then it started to V up, and now. Last week, we had more showings year over year than we did the previous year with 35% less inventory. That means bidding wars, right? We're showing more, we're having more showings than with less inventory.
Sure. So I guess the message is for, certainly for sellers, there's no reason to hold back. And hopefully you'll get some more inventory and maybe that'll help the market a little bit for buyers. One item that we've talked about a little bit with Dr. Colgan and with Tim was, out-of-state buyers who might want to be relocating to Maine to get out of a urban hotspot. You deal with buyers from all over who are coming looking at property in Maine, either as full-time principal residences or second homes. What are you seeing in terms of in-migration and that impact upon the market?
It's a little too early to tell, but anecdotally, we are feeling there's more inquiries from out of state. We have a 14-day quarantine, so it'll take a little bit to see how this plays out, but out of staters, we're doing FaceTime showings, they're submitting sight unseen offers. Historically, we see about 25% of our purchases from out of staters, and that is mostly who we would expect: Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire, Florida, and California. So will be very interesting to see how this plays out this year. My hunch is yes, absolutely, from what we're hearing. People now, as we've mentioned, it was mentioned earlier, they are working from home. They've proven to their employers that they can telecommute and they can choose to live where they want. And as Tim mentioned, they want to be part of our community. We're seeing, home offices become very important. We're suggesting that sellers, if they have a spare bedroom, go ahead and stage it as an office. So as people are scrolling through, they can really see themselves living and working in the home. And sometimes they need two home offices if both partners are working from home. So it'll be a trend to watch for sure.
Great, thank you. So I want to turn to Kevin, and we are going to come back to all of you with questions from the panel, which are from our audience, which are starting to come in. But Kevin, again, thank you for joining us. If you could give us a quick recap of what you see as the high points of the market for commercial construction from 2019 that we can use as a benchmark for what's happening now, that would be great. And then I've got some other specific questions for you.
Yeah, 2019, I think, was a record year for the majority of contractors. Our business was up about 35% from 2018. So it was going gangbusters up until March, middle of March, and then a big drastic change happened.
Yeah. So in terms of that big drastic change, how has that impacted you? Have you seen projects that were, that you were estimating or bidding on either go away or be delayed? What's happening in terms of the pipeline of work that you're seeing in front of you, given the impact of the coronavirus?
Certainly, Gary, that's a good question. And for our company, Landry French, we actually have a silver lining in this. And we had approximately 4 projects put on hold, not deleted, not taken off the street, but just delayed. We had our existing client that stepped up. It's no secret, it's Abbott Laboratories. They get the Corona test kits. We are approximately renovating 160,000 square feet, turning it into repurposing labs. They leased 140,000 square feet in Westbrook. We're turning that all into lab space. So the projects that were delayed are now turned into a positive, because I got to take all those people and put them on the Abbott projects to fill the void. So
obviously, we know that Abbott Labs is a benefactor of some positive impacts from the coronavirus. What are you seeing in terms of other industries? Are there different types of projects, whether they're institutional, office, industrial? Any insight in terms of which segments of the commercial construction market you're seeing? You're able to make any kind of statements about in terms of how you see those particular segments being impacted?
Sure, definitely. I know we have 3 higher ed projects that have been put on pause. I believe they're trying to figure out, one, how is it going to look when they do return? 2, when are they going to return? Are they going to return in the fall or not? All indications right now are they are going to return. So they're figuring out what is going to look like. So the pause has been placed. There's 3 projects of higher education right now. I also have one large office user, commercial office user, that has also pushed pause. I think back to what Tim was saying, how is the office space going to look when they return? How many people can they get in a specific square foot area? And I believe they're all taking an advisement and trying to figure this out as we go through this together.
So one last question for you before we open it up to our audience questions. So I know that one of the challenges in the construction industry for the past several years has been workforce shortages, particularly in various trades where new workers are, where workers are retiring and new workers are not coming up to take their place as much. Are you seeing a softening in the market that will help put the workforce and demand in better balance as it relates to construction?
I am not seeing a softening in the market because there's several large projects out there right now that are assuming a lot of the workers. I have saw a lot of mid-sized projects been put on hold. I see for the first time in many years, smaller projects, let's say $1 million, $2 million type projects where there's 10 bidders on it. Haven't seen that in years. Usually you'll see 1 to 3. Lucky if you get 4 bidders on it. And now I'm seeing a list of 10. I would think that that's probably they're going to get aggressive and the prices will come down. Subcontractor wise, there's still enough in the pipeline where I don't predict those costs coming down. So, I feel the larger projects won't go up, but they won't go down. It'll be status quo. Smaller projects, I think you'll see a benefit of these times.
And does that tend to mean that, for large subcontractors and trade contractors, it may not be, they're the ones who work on the bigger project, and smaller contractors may see some softening of the market? Is that a takeaway that we can take from that?
That's what I would predict. Yes, and I am seeing that every morning when we look at the Dodge report and see who's bidding. We specifically don't bid a lot of projects. We negotiate, but I like to keep a pulse on who's where and what subs are where. So every morning we usually take a look at it. And this morning was a small project that was $150,000. There was 12 bidders on it. I just haven't seen that in years. So it was an interesting takeaway from that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I want to bring Dr. Colgan back into the discussion. And we've got a number of questions that have come in. This first one is for you, Dr. Colgan. Are you seeing measurable differences between the economic impacts of the pandemic on Maine and nationally? I know we've heard that Maine potentially could be one of the hardest hit states due to our being the oldest state in the nation. On the other hand, we've been talking about how Maine may benefit from in-migration. Do you have some insight about where Maine falls in the overall impact of the recession that I'd have to say we're in, resulting from the coronavirus?
So we need to think about this in several phases. In what I'll call the current phase, which is sort of phase 1, the shock. I think Maine has generally tracked a little better than the U.S. as a whole. But when you're losing 100,000 jobs, and that's say 12% of your workforce, the difference between 12% and 14%, which might be the U.S. number, is really not worth talking about. We've probably done a little bit better. I think the reports that Maine is one of the more vulnerable places largely was driven by demographic factors, particularly the age of our population, and not necessarily the structure of our economy. I think if this had hit in the summer, it might have been much more dramatic, and that's going to be the question in phase two, and that's going to be the summer, and how much of the recovery, how much of the economy can not get back to normal, not going to happen, but how much of the tourist economy in the summer, on which so many businesses in Maine depend for most of their annual profits, can take place. There we might fall behind the rest of the US because of our overdependence on the summer season. Then looking a little further beyond that, the whole question is going to be, I think, largely the structure and nature of whatever fiscal help is coming from Washington, if any does indeed come.
Thank you. This question is for Deva. Deva, do you, among the different segments of the residential market, whether it be first-time home buyers, move-up homes, higher-end homes, second homes, are you seeing any trends that are different or relating to these various segments of the residential market?
That's an excellent question. It's affecting all segments. When we look at single families versus condos in Q2, single family home sales are down 18% and condos are down 32%. I think it's a little too early to tell if that's a trend, but definitely something that we're keeping our eye on.
Interesting. Tim, are commercial tenants demanding additional services from landlords relating to pandemic response arrangements?
So we have very little direction about best practices from Washington, certainly, and even not quite as much as I'd like to see from Augusta. We are instituting a whole variety of what we consider to be best practices, from reading what's going on all over the world. We're putting signage up by next week for single person use for elevators, or at least people who have people in their pod or family, so that bathrooms are single use if there's not appropriate physical distancing possible, that the fire stairs are unidirectional, so that fire stairs that emanate from building lobbies are up and other ones in buildings are down, all these sorts of things. In the entrances to buildings, we're putting sanitation stations. We're putting at the entrance to elevators wipes so people can wipe the buttons. I have people who from certain tenants were asking without specific questions, because they're not really sure what to ask yet. So we're trying to keep ahead of it. I mean, we're bringing in more fresh air in all of our buildings. We're going to MERV 13 filters on the HVAC systems, though there is no published data to tell us that that the higher quality filters, like you might find in operating rooms in hospitals, will actually work to reduce coronavirus spread. We're doing everything we can. And because there's so little published data about really what best practices are, when we do get queries from tenants, they're sort of general, like what's going on, but we're proactively reaching out and describing to our tenants what we are doing.
Great, thank you. There's a lot to consider there. Tim, another question is, do you see any trend towards what we call hoteling of offices by major office tenants rather than offices that are dedicated to one user?
So that's something that's been going on for years. I think it's too soon to understand what's going to happen because of the coronavirus during this pandemic. Just finished the new headquarters spaces for Camden National Bank, their Southern Maine headquarters at 2 Canal Plaza. They started moving in the last couple of weeks. But there are a number of spaces in their demise premises that are dedicated to what you refer to as hoteling. I don't know if people will want to use the same computers and desks that someone else has used. It will require extra cleaning. We have in our buildings now, extra cleaning going on during the day. So it used to be overnight, there'd be cleaning, come in the morning, and that's it. But we now have cleaners coming in through the day to clean high touch areas. So as far as that relates to hoteling, I don't know yet. I know there's just been a slow and steady trend to dedicate a small but significant proportion of space to hoteling in the last 10 years. And I would not predict at this point where that's going to go in the future.
Okay, well, we're actually out of time. I know we could continue this conversation for easily for another hour, but I'm hopeful and expect that MEREDA is going to have a number of additional webinars where we touch upon, all of these various impacts from the coronavirus, and including a few more this month in June. So please stay tuned to the MEREDA website for those announcements and the emails that you get from Shelley Clark, our Director of Operations. I want to thank our panel, each of you, Dr. Colgan, Tim Soley, David Davin, and Kevin French, for a really interesting discussion today. I want to thank our sponsors, Eaton Peabody, Dugas Construction, Express Copy, and the last one that I'm missing. My apologies. Anyway, thank you all, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.